So I've been playing around with Asset Studio recently. This is a tool that lets you view and extract resources from Unity games. I mainly wanted to look into the Hello Hero games, and I found a lot of interesting stuff that I can make a video about, but nobody cares about Hello Hero, and that makes me sad. Well, in that case, what about these shows? People care about these, and they happen to have had some games with 3D models. We'll start with Tobot, since that's what most people are probably here for. So Tobot had these educational games made by the company Dragonfly. These aren't really anything to write home about, just some very basic games made to teach Korean children the English alphabet. The one we're interested in is this VR one, which uses the old cardboard VR setup to put kids in a room with the Tobots. In order to rip a Unity game, we're going to need Asset Studio and the corresponding resource files for the game in question. In this case, the game is small enough that everything fits into the base APK, so just go to grab that. Disclaimer, do not haphazardly download APKs from the internet unless you know what you're doing. I am not responsible for what happens if you do. You can directly access the contents of an APK file by changing the extension to zip. From here, you'll want to find the assets themselves, which in this case are an assets bin data with a whole lot of gibberish files. Open this folder in Asset Studio and you'll be able to view what's inside. The easiest way to export the files for use is to click this Export All Objects button here, which will output a bunch of FBX files with the 3D models in them. Now for this game, most of the files here aren't of much use for us. Many of these meshes simply represent words that start with each letter of the alphabet, you know, the classic alphabet teaching tool. This does give us Tori and Sick Kyle, and more importantly, Adventure X's vehicle mode. What is of use to us is these folders, which contain fully rigged 3D models of, in order, Adventure X, Adventure Y, Adventure Z, Evolution X, Evolution Y, C, D, R, W, Original X, Original Y, and Original Z. For the most part, they're pretty well made, though the textures are pretty crusty. These are 512 by 512, which is fine for a typical character, not so much for a big robot with a lot of detail. There's also some inaccuracies, like here you can see Adventure X's visor is wrong and C's neck is too low, both of which can be fixed with a little tweaking in Blender. For the most part, the armatures let the characters move in most ways that are necessary. The arms, legs, head, torso, and some extraneous parts are given bones to work with. This is pretty much enough for you to put these Tobots in whatever poses you see fit. You can even make C kind of do his Hypervox attack, though none of them have moving fingers, just these closed fists and these karate chopping hands in D's case. And R skirt flaps and Adventure X's tools are completely static and kind of clip through their legs. Speaking of R, his model is kind of a microcosm of all the weird tidbits that I noticed from these models. Immediately, you can see that the first problem is that his backpack is completely screwed up. You can fix that for the most part by resetting its bone, but you can see there's still some issues. That's because the vertex weights are wrong. Now, I'm not exactly the best person to explain what this is for those of you who aren't familiar with 3D rigging, but each vertex that makes up this mesh has a certain weight value that determines which bone movements it follows and by how much. As you can see, not all the vertices on the backpack are properly assigned to the corresponding bone, and are instead attached to the upper arms. We can reassign these vertices so that things look right. I'm assuming this may have been a mistake that happened because the arms are clipping into the backpack, though maybe this didn't actually look like this in the game. Asset Studio isn't always perfect, and neither is Blender when importing FBX files. Here you can see I have a model that's animated correctly in 3D Viewer, but not in Blender, because in the import process something goes wrong and all the left and right weights get reversed. Some of the other weight issues I found were that this part of W's leg is attached to his head, and part of Adventure Z's crotch moves along with his legs.
My crotch hurts.
And I suppose it's time to talk about the elephant in the room, which is that this model, isn't very good. Obviously, a lot of these models are skimping out on some details since they're meant for a mobile game, but R and to an extent Evo X get hit with this particularly badly. If you turn off textures and compare R to W and Evo X to Evo Y, you can kinda see the more flat areas with less sculpted detail. This is especially noticeable in the heads, which are incredibly basic compared to everyone else's, these ones being identifiable even without any textures. Now, I was just working with Evo X and Evo Y for reasons. And I found that Evo X actually has more vertices than Evo Y, so I initially assumed it was a model size limitation. Except no, C actually gets over 5,000 vertices, so I don't really know what's going on here. It's not even consistent, like how Evo X's wheels are better than Evo Y's, and how amongst all of R's basic geometry, they decided to pick out these shoulder bits. Obviously, this is getting very nitpicky, and I'm glad it's possible to get these at all. Just a quick fire of other oddities I noticed. R doesn't have his water cannon, but this incomplete shell model made to be placed on this shelf has half a water cannon, and all of the cannon's textures are in the file. The Triton Squad and the Quadston Squad don't share the same basic scale, and Evo Y's texture mapping is wrong. It just is. I've seen textures not being linked, I've seen every armature error under the sun, but I've never seen an incorrect texture mapping. Thankfully, this is easily fixable in Blender if you know what you're doing. These guys also have animations. They won't come with the models with the default export options, and you'll have to manually select the model with animations to export. All that for animations that aren't in character for any of these guys at all. Advent X also has a separate copy of his model meant to sit next to the kid playing the game. Since the model doesn't have fingers, they actually made a dummy finger to place on his hand, which is fun. Oddly well modeled, too. Now, Indonesian viewers might be thinking, what about Indomilk? If you don't know, Indomilk is an Indonesian dairy company that partnered with Young Toys to make 2 separate tie-in mobile games where you unlock Tobots by scanning certain Indomilk products. These include the entire Tobot lineage all the way up to the end of Athlon, and I'm not deliberately neglecting something here, but unfortunately my asset studio runs have not bore much fruit. Reaching the assets of these games are a little bit different from the first one. Because the games are much bigger, they presumably downloaded additional resource files, which are where the assets are actually located. Typically, you can find these in an XAPK file. Convert that to a zip, then pull out the OBB file, then convert that to a zip to get your stuff. After all that, what you can salvage in Indomilk Tobot Hero is relatively not much. You'll get a lot of folders, but most of the time they won't have anything of substance. The only things that are complete and of interest here are these vehicle modes, which are cool, as well as the stages, which emulate the Tobot locations pretty well. It even has the Tobot base. The few robot models that are here are completely untextured though. Some of these are the same models from the Alphabet game, while the new ones are the Shieldon variant of Evo X and Y, Akbot, King Carbot, Titan, and Triton. As far as I can tell, Shieldon X and Y are not rigged at all, while the other 4 are rigged but not properly. If you import them into Blender, you'll find that the armature is tiny, and you'll have to scale it up and realign it to get things to look right. Also, Triton doesn't seem to have a functioning hierarchy of his own, so you're gonna have to dig him out of this abomination. For Indomilk Tobot Galaxy, I found this vehicle mode of speed. Guess how much I care? 0! There's also these models of Galaxy Detective's villains, which, cool I guess. Makes it easier than ever to make fun of Star Ring. But there is one good thing I managed to find. Athlon Magma 6! From the export, he's sharing an armature of Star Ring, truly a fate worse than death. Just gotta get him out of there, but like before, this armature is not properly aligned at all. Thankfully, since all the weights are still correct, we can make this usable just by moving these bones in the right places. The textures are incredibly crusty, more so than anything else in this video, but I do like Magma 6, so it gets a pass. I also thought I'd point out that this is actually based on Mini Magma 6. Yeah, I don't really know where everything else is. Maybe there's some additional resource files I'm missing, or maybe the servers only send the files when the corresponding products are being scanned. I'd really like to get my hands on the rest, especially Athlon Champion, because I like Athlon Champion, darn it. Alright, now Biklonz time. Welcome to Biklonz Attack of the Bulgasari, which was an actual competent video game, surprisingly enough. The gameplay system was a simplistic turn-based format where you match these card patterns to gain attack charges. However, if multiple copies of the same pattern are lined up, you could swipe that pattern and get all of those charges at once with just one action. And this is where a lot of the strategy came in. Do I take this chain of 2 now, or do I spend one action grabbing the pattern next to the chain and hope the next pattern line adds to this chain? Stacking up enough charges built this meter, which allowed you to combine your units. The combined unit also has full HP regardless of how much HP the individual units had left, meaning you would also have to put some thought into when to use that combined button. It was overall just a really solid game that required a surprising amount of strategy to it. That is, until you unlocked Arrow and just brute force your way through every encounter. Getting to the assets is the same process as the Indomilk games, XAPK to zip, to OBB, to zip, to unzip. Now, for whatever reason, almost none of the textures are properly linked to the models, but this is an easy fix in Blender. Every character has a bunch of animations that are actually connected properly with the default export, but if I showed those all off, we'd be here all day, so here's a montage instead. The enemies use standard textures. Tam here has been reduced to a blob wearing a PNG of a landfill, but the creepy factor is still there. The automatic export completely fails to grab Kangchi, but he'll come if you do it manually. Komin Pacha looks like it should work, but attempting to import into Blender fails to bring in the vertex weights of all things, meaning this thing ain't moving unless you take the time to get it to work yourself. Fortunately, we can still salvage this with Noasis. Noasis is a model viewer and converter boasting support for a lot of things. I originally downloaded it to view Ninja Ripper outputs back in the day when I didn't know I could get stuff straight from the source, but it works on Asset Studio outputs too. In fact, it works better than pretty much every other option I've tried and fixes most of the problems I've run into with my exports. There are some things that Blender and 3D Viewer work better with though, so it's good to have all of them as options. So I've got Komi Pacha loaded up in Noasis, and as you can see, he works perfectly fine. So from here, we can actually re-export this from Noasis as the new FBX file and send it back to Blender. Noasis merges all the animations into one, but that's fine because now we have a functioning Komi Pacha. Could use a mouth though. Now, I'm gonna save one of these guys for last, because there's a couple things I have to explain before I can go over what this one's problems are. Now let's turn our attention to the mecha drill, which looks really clean. Yeah, it's pretty polygonal, but I don't really see any visual crust around here. How did they do it? I gotta see the texture file. Oh. For the uninitiated, a typical texture file looks something like this, with all the detail kinda spread across an image that then gets lined up onto the unwrapped coordinates of a model's vertices. The mech control, as well as all of the good guy Biklonz mechs, instead opt to use a color palette and just kinda slap all the vertices onto their respective color squares. So it's basically the same thing as setting a base color. Though, ironically, that does mean that these guys have actually aged much better than everything else in this video since they don't have to deal with crusty textures. Yeah, they're missing some detail and they don't look quite as nice as they do in the show, but that's asking for a bit much. That's a good segue into talking about the actual Biklonz units though. The game's development didn't get past the first half of the Mega Beast stuff, meaning we don't get Argentavis, Mammoth, Giant Elk, Thunder Guardian, Barbarian King, and Locomoto, although evidence that they had some plans for them are in the game's files. That still leaves us with the entire Infinity lineage, plus Direwolf, Sabertooth, and Cross Attacker. However, if you try to bring them into Blender, you'll find that Taurus, Leo, Aries, Scorpio, and Hurricane are less than ideal to work with. Normally, you want a model to be rigged to an armature like this. The aforementioned 5, however, look like this. A giant jumbled mess of base axes. These are useful for setting pivot points where other objects can rotate, like your camera for example. But you don't want your entire model to be animated with just these. For one, it's just a mess to work with, but more importantly, the animations aren't linked to one armature. They're instead spread across every single one of these axes, meaning you'd have to meticulously reassign each one if you want to change the animations. Now, I doubt these are actually rigged like this, since this is a double conversion from Unity to FBX to Blender. I've had some botched manual Asset Studio exports that have just spit out a bunch of base axes, while if I set the settings correctly, it's all fine. But I do know that the process used to model and rig these 5 were different in some way. Look at this. Every single piece of this model is a different mesh. Even the fingers here. Each microscopic section has its own movement that is meticulously altered for an animation. I have to ask, why would you subject yourself to making this like this? This looks like it would have been miserable to build, and yet they did this 5 times. Luckily, if you put these through an Oasis, you'll get an actual armature, though with way too many bones that you'll want to clean up. They eventually switched to something more reasonable, with Ursa and the rest of the combiners being comprised of larger body parts, though that does make some of the arms look weird. Meanwhile, the Cross Attacker set is one mesh entirely besides the weapons. Speaking of weapons, Infinity does come with the Infinite Crusher with the show-accurate handle, though instead of actually wielding it, he just kinda telekinetically summons it out of the ground and hurls it at the enemy. And take a look at his head. He's wearing that helmet pretty loosely, don't you think? It's missing the visor too. I wonder if... Aha! Ursa's humanoid mode head is actually fully modeled beneath the helmet, which is interesting because the actual Ursa in-game doesn't transform into humanoid form. But even over here, if you remove the bear head, we'll find that same humanoid head beneath it. This one even has the stripes up here, though the mouthpiece isn't colored in. So, theoretically, we have everything you would need to build Ursa's humanoid form. Here's what that might look like. Next, we have Geo pedaling away in the charging station. This was an additional minigame where you just hit the button at the right time to get currency and stamina. Let's see here. There's a station, the helmet, the bike. Oh, I wonder where Geo is. Okay, I can confidently say this is the worst armature screw-up I've seen that Blender will actually accept. We can reset the armature to see that the problem is that the base location of the armature and the model aren't lined up. Once you fix that problem, the model will work perfectly fine. So, this model actually started off as beginner Geo, but will switch to intermediate Geo after the Mega Beast update. Except it isn't actually intermediate Geo, it's just the same beginner Geo model textured to look like intermediate Geo. Guess I figured people wouldn't notice. I mean, I sure didn't. Look, he's even still got the Taurus activator and the grid chip holder. And finally, we return to the one enemy I held off on talking about, Mogire. Problem number 1, the armature and model aren't aligned. Okay, let's try to put them together. Problem number 2, since this thing isn't humanoid, it's not exactly clear how it should be aligned. On top of problem number 3, I think a lot of the bones don't get imported properly, which means, you guessed it, more base axes. Right, then we reprocess it through an Oasis. Problem number 4, some bones aren't working. That's a scaling issue, so just fix that up, but we also see problem number 5. Whatever noise this is doing is screwing up the model somehow. Then, let's get creative and attach the model of the original export to the armature of the Noasis export. That uncovers problem number 6, the weights are inverted. It's an all-stars encore of every problem we've witnessed so far. Is it possible to get working? Maybe, but it's gonna be a lot of maintenance until it's functional. But besides that, there we have it. A bunch of cool models from our favorite set of Korean robot shows. We can have all sorts of fun with these, pose them, animate them, put them in weird situations, and that's all the Retrobot show tie-in games I have to talk about. Aw, dang it! Potendogs Party, a tie-in game for Retrobot's standalone series, Potendogs. It's a fine show with decent writing, but to me it was always consolation prize the show for Tobot fans in the dark ages. I appreciate it for its willingness to be experimental, though not everything it tries lands. Karabrekwa made a video about it if you're curious, and he also touches on the social commentary that the show has. It didn't reach my brain because I gotta stuff more useless Hello Hero knowledge in here because no one else will, dang it! So anyways, Potendogs Party. It's a Fall Guys clone, and if you'd believe it, a bad one. Okay, yeah, that's harsh, and I imagine a lot of talented people did their best on this project on a tight deadline. But the one time I played this game, it just didn't function very well. Everything felt very stiff, and the controls are pretty poor. And this toon shading, oof. The outlines don't even look good in the promotional videos. I can tell you from experience that doing stuff with outlines in 3D is really hard, but there are certainly other Unity games that do it better than this, like Friendsmart Rush. This time you won't be needing Next APK. If you do find one, just take out the standard APK and extract from that. Looking at the dogs themselves, the models are actually pretty good, though the rigging could be better. After fixing the same unlinked texture sync from Biklonz, the texture quality is a significant improvement too, which might be a given since this is the newest game in the video. For some reason, the default export lumps all the costumes together instead of putting them in different hierarchies like Friendsmart Rush. But that's easily fixed. And hey, we've got the entire cast here, and they all have their armored beast modes, and why are these incomplete? To be clear, the Potendogs' normal modes and armor modes do differ in their base designs, but usually they're close enough. And a good number of them do actually get their full armor, but some of them just don't for some reason. They couldn't have allocated some of the budget put into the funny fruit hats to finish the armored forms. Also, these two have the same issue as Komipacha, where the vertex wings aren't available. This can be fixed with the same Noesis method. And then we've got the stage stuff, the traps, the maps, and whatnot, which aren't particularly exciting. I do like this arena, though. And with that, I've covered everything interesting I was able to find in all the Retrobot games. Nothing is particularly perfect, but they're not meant to be. They still do the job, and I'm happy to have them, and... wait. These games are all made in Unity. They must share a similar rigging system. I wonder if... oh,